all of those who have contributed to our service today, from Igor, who's the elder on duty, to the pianist and the musician and the lovely storytelling, and the tech guys. As I've told you before, tech is not something I understand. I'm very grateful. At work, I'm on a first name basis with our tech person, and he knows when he has to help me all the time. And I'm grateful to all of you who contribute to worshiping in the house of the Lord, and for the beautiful music that we had. Now, Matthew chapter 5, verse 4 says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." This is a promise from God to us, and it's a promise best claimed here, regardless of how we are feeling here. Because as human beings, we mourn because we have lost. And there are many different types of losses that we experience. We experience the loss of hopes, dreams, and aspirations. In my childhood home, I lived next door to neighbors who had 2 children, and their eldest son was just a couple of years younger than me. And this boy, he lived, slept, drank, ate airplanes. He was going to be a pilot, either military or commercial. And then one day, his parents received a phone call to say that he had been rushed to hospital because he had collapsed. It turns out this young man had an aneurysm in his brain that had burst. He survived it, but it put paid to any dream that he had of being a pilot, because with that kind of medical history, you will never receive medical clearance to be able to pilot a commercial or military airplane. And he mourned. He mourned the loss of this future that he had held for himself. We mourn the loss of relationships, whether they be friendships that have fallen by the wayside or come to an end through some kind of upset or misunderstanding, whether they be the ending of mentorships, whether it is friction in familial relationships, whether it be church family or whether it be blood family. We mourn the ending of romantic relationships, and just because you are a devoted Christian does not mean that you will not be a victim of divorce. A friend of mine who loves the Lord never thought that after 30 years of relationship that she would be a divorcee. And she shared with me how strange it was, how challenging it was, how weird it was to be mourning the loss of somebody while they still lived. Which brings us to one of the most intense reasons that we as human beings mourn, and that is the loss of the life of somebody that we loved. And even more intense when that loss is because they died too young. We mourn loss. And as Christians, we cry out to the Lord, why? Why did you allow this to happen? You could have changed the pathway. Why, Lord? And there are times that as we process our loss, whatever form that loss may be, we feel a sense of injustice. And we start to wonder, was my trust in God misplaced? And if we are brutally honest, there are times that we reach a point in our relationship with God as we process loss that we actually feel betrayed by God. And then we find that mourning becomes partnered with anger. And we cry out to God, why? Why did you allow this to happen? Why did you not protect me from this loss? And then we find ourselves standing at a crossroads. Do we continue to trust God and reach out to Him regardless, despite our feelings? Or do we turn from God and cut ourselves off from Him because of our feelings? It comes down to a question of faith. Now, God is serious when He makes us this promise, blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. And one of the ways in which He provides us with comfort is through His word. So today we're going to look at this question of faith by taking a deep dive into the story of Lazarus. So we're going to travel back a little over 2,000 years and some thousands of miles away, and we're going to end up in a little village called Bethany, but we're going to start off meeting Jesus in the beautiful, luscious region of Perea. But before we travel, let us pray. Father in heaven, loss is real, and it hurts. And often we don't understand. And we can feel cut off from you. And we question whether you really care. And so as we come to your word, I pray that your Holy Spirit will give us understanding beyond our own comprehension. And I pray, Lord, that everything that I am may now recede, so that together we can sit at your feet and receive that blessing of comfort from your word. Amen. So we're going to meet up with Jesus in John chapter 11. So let's turn together to John chapter 11. Now in John chapter 10, Jesus had been in Jerusalem. He had been teaching, as was his way, at the temple. And when he was asked, he testified to the fact that he was the Son of God. The Pharisees, the Sadducees, those very important people on the Sanhedrin Council, they were exceedingly angry when he claimed to be the Son of God, and they accused him of blasphemy, and they wanted to stone him to death. But in verse 39 of chapter 10, he escapes their nefarious intentions, and he crosses over the river Jordan into this region of Perea, where he continues his Father's work. And it's there that Jesus is when a messenger runs up to him exhausted, having brought an urgent message from the household of his very good friends, Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. The message is very simple in verse 3. It says that the sisters sent word to Jesus, "Lord, the one you love is sick." So let's just pause there for a minute and just take a little deeper look at this. Lord, the one you love is sick. Now, Jesus was very good friends with Lazarus, Martha, and Mary. Whenever he was in the region, he would stop by their home and visit with them. He would often overnight with them. He would minister to people out of their home. He loved them. They were good friends of his. And yet Lazarus was deathly ill. So here we understand that being a follower of Christ, being a friend of Christ, being a Christian, being a believer does not give us a free pass from the pain and the suffering and the challenges of life. But it does mean that we can reach out to God for help to traverse those situations. Notice too the brevity, how succinct this message is to Jesus. Notice not just what is said, but what is not said. The girls do not beg Jesus. They do not plead with Jesus. They do not try to negotiate with Jesus or barter with Jesus. In fact, they do not even ask Jesus to come or to heal their brother. They simply inform Jesus of their situation. Lord, the one you love is sick. Because they love Jesus and they are confident in Jesus' love for them, they entrust their situation, as dire as it is, completely into his hands, and they allow him to decide what his response will be to the situation. Wow, that's faith. Jesus sends them, I'm sure by same messenger back, a message of comfort in verse 4. He says, this sickness will not end in death. No, it is for God's glory, so that God's Son may be glorified through it. But hang on a minute. We know this story, and we know that this illness did actually end in death. But we also know that Jesus doesn't lie. So what message was Jesus actually sending here when he said, this illness will not end in death? Now hold pause on that question, because Martha is going to answer it for us in a little bit, okay? We'll come back to that question. Strangely enough, even though Jesus is such good friends with this little trio of siblings, he doesn't immediately stop the work he is doing and travel to Bethany to be with them. It says in verse 5, Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus, yet when he heard that Lazarus was sick, he stayed where he was 2 more days. What we're actually seeing here is a delayed response to prayer. Sometimes God does not respond to our need immediately, but we must never think that that means that God doesn't care or he is indifferent to our suffering. That little family, they were suffering. That was a quick onset illness onto Lazarus. He was in a very bad way, and his sisters were in an agony of heart over his suffering in this illness. Yet Jesus delayed his response to their plea, their prayer. A delayed response from God does not mean that God does not care or he is indifferent. It does mean that God has a plan, and we can trust in that plan. After 2 days, Jesus says to his disciples, let's go back to Judea. Now, in the next couple of verses, the disciples kind of respond with, and I paraphrase, why on earth do you want to go back there? They're trying to kill you in Jerusalem. Why would you want to go back there? Not a single disciple, even though the disciples would also have been good friends to the trio of siblings. Lazarus would have been their bro, yet not one of the disciples says, oh, are we finally going to go to Lazarus and see how he's doing? The truth of the matter is that when we mourn a loss, when we go through difficult times and challenges, quite often our family and our friends, they let us down. They are so focused on their own lives and their own busyness that they forget that we are in need of comfort. And this is a reminder also to each one of us that we should not allow ourselves to become so busy in our own lives that we forget about the needs of those around us. Now, it's pretty easy to reach out to those that we care about, those that we love. In fact, John chapter 6, verse 32 and 33 says to us, if you love those who love you, what credit is it to you? Because even sinners love those who love them. If you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is it to you? Even sinners do that. God asks more of us. Because another way in which he brings comfort to those who mourn is through you and me as an extension of him. We are God's hands, we are his feet, we are his voice. And God asks us to bring comfort, his comfort, to those who mourn. Now, it's not always very easy to tell when somebody is going through something. You know, when somebody is mourning the loss of the life of somebody, that tends to be something we all share, and we all know so-and-so has died and they need comfort. But there are many other losses that we don't choose to share for one reason or another. And it's not ever easy to tell what is going on in somebody's life. We look at each other and we go, oh, he's strong in the faith. Oh, he comes to church every week and he's always so positive. Oh, she's a prayer warrior. She's always doing okay. But that may not be the truth of how someone is actually feeling inside. And you and I, we don't know, but God does know that that person is mourning a loss. Which is why sometimes God puts somebody on your mind. You'll be driving your car and suddenly you'll think about them. You'll be at the store and suddenly their name will pop in your head. You might dream about them. You might wake up in the morning and they are on your mind. Because God knows what's going on in their life and knows that they need comfort or they need encouragement. Some years ago, almost a decade, Aidan and I were experiencing one loss after another. It was a tough time. We could barely come up for air, and it felt like another wave was crashing down on us. In fact, our pastor at that time said to me, I've asked God, how much more can one family take? And it was a lonely time, and it was an isolating time. And I felt so alone. And I quietly said to the Lord, I know the words and the promises. And I know that you are true and you are sure. But Lord, I'm not feeling it. I feel so alone. I need to know that you are working things out. I need to know you're on our case. I need to know that you care. And then I left it with the Lord. And about a day later, a friend of mine called, a good friend of mine, but we the type of friendship that we only talk to each other maybe once or twice a year because busyness of families, and we also live in two very different time zones. So when I'm asleep, she's awake. When she's awake, I'm asleep. But we have the kind of friendship, and girls will relate to this, even if we don't talk for a year, when we talk again, it's like no time has gone between the chatting times. And so we talk for over an hour, okay, possibly two. But I came off that phone call feeling validated, feeling loved, feeling that there was somebody in the world other than my husband and son who cared whether I lived or died. And I felt comforted. And then the next day, I received a text from somebody who I would really say is an acquaintance type friendship. You know, somebody like you see them at church every week and you just chat a little bit. You know superficially the things that are going on in their life, but you don't really meet up outside of church. You don't really text or whatever. And she just sent me a simple text words to the effect of, you're on my mind. I feel as though you're going through something. I want you to know I'm praying for you. There's no way she could have known I was going through something. I knew that the Lord had put me on her mind. And then I received a card in the mail. I do not know who the card was from. It wasn't anonymous or anything. Their names were in the card. They'd written a few lines of affirmation and appreciation and written their names, but I actually don't know who they are. I can't put those names to any faces in my church community. And it just blew me away that somebody had taken the time to write a personal message. They'd taken their own money to go and buy a card and pay for postage to mail it to me. And I knew that God was letting me know through these three people, somebody I knew well, somebody who I knew superficially, and somebody that I knew not at all. God was letting me know, I am present. I am here. I know what you are going through. You are not alone. And one day I'm going to ask God, how many people did you actually approach? But it was those three that responded to your call. So next time you find yourself thinking about someone, don't say to yourself, oh, I'll text them later, because you will forget. And don't say to yourself, oh, I don't really know that person well. Oh, I don't think that person actually really likes me. They wouldn't really want to hear from me. God is asking you to be his comfort to that person because he knows that they are mourning. So be in service to the God that you serve. So Jesus reminds the disciples about Lazarus, whom they had forgotten about. And he says to them in verse 11, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I'm going there to wake him up. Now, those disciples, sometimes they could be a little slow to understand, and they are loath to put themselves or Jesus in any danger, because if somebody happened to Jesus, then the plans the disciples had for him to be king on earth wouldn't take place. They put their goals and their priorities first before wanting to go and comfort their mate, their friend, who'd been going through a hard time. We do that sometimes, don't we? And so they say to Jesus, well, if he's sleeping, that's a good thing. It means he's getting better. In other words, we don't really have to go. So Jesus speaks to them plainly, and he says to them in verse 14, Lazarus is dead. You know, one of the greatest misconceptions, or deceptions, I should say, that Satan has managed to perpetuate on the Christian world is this idea of an immortal soul, and that when we die, we either go to heaven or we go to hell. It's a lie. Yeah, out of Jesus, our Creator's mouth, we hear the truth about death. Jesus himself likens death to sleep, from which those who are friends of God, who know God, who have accepted God, will be called by his voice to awaken from that sleep. Here is the truth in the story of Lazarus. And then I have to laugh a little bit, because in verse 16, and it's neither here or there, but it amuses me, so I'm going to share it with you. In verse 16, Thomas, I think he's a little bit of a drama queen, because he kind of says, oh, well, let us go, and then we can all die with him. And so the disciples and Jesus, they all go along to Bethany. Now, it's a 1 day's walking journey, a comfortable walk to get to Bethany, but it actually takes Jesus 2 days, because even though his goal, his focus is to go to the household of Lazarus, Jesus does not neglect to care for those that he meets along the way. So it takes him a little longer to get there. And that's just a little nugget of comfort for you and me. Never, ever think that God is so busy helping others that he doesn't have time for you and your needs. And so on arrival, Jesus sends a message to Martha, or to the household. Martha gets the message and asks her to come and meet him. That little household, Bethany, was not far from Jerusalem, just a few miles. And this little family was well known within the community. So there were lots of people, important people, who would have traveled from Jerusalem. Those ones who actually wanted a poor outcome for Jesus, they knew the relationship with Lazarus, and so they were surely also going to go to Lazarus's house in case Jesus turned up. There would have been family there, there would have been friends with there, and of course there would have been professional mourners as well, because that was the way of things. And so the household was very busy with very many people. And Jesus doesn't want to go into that scene and that crowd of people. So he sends a message that he is come. Martha gets the message and she slips away from the household so that she can go and meet quietly somewhere with Jesus and his disciples that are with him, which is a reminder to us. It is good when we have family and friends to support us in our losses, in our mourning, in our difficulty. But we must always remember to take the time to meet privately with Jesus. We must not neglect that private time with our God. I'm going to read from verse 21 because what we're going to see here from Martha is such an incredible expression of faith. She says in verse 21, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. But I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. And Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again. She answers, I know. He will rise again in the resurrection at that last day. Jesus says, I am the resurrection and the life. He who believes in me will live, even though he dies, and whoever lives and believes in me will never die. Do you believe this? Now just look at what Jesus said there. He who lives and believes in me will never die, and yet we die. So what was he meaning? Martha understands that Jesus is speaking on a spiritual level, a depth of spirituality, in the same way when he sent that message, this illness will not end in death. Jesus was speaking from a spiritual depth perspective, which Martha understands. And we see that in her reply when she says in verse 27, yes, Lord, I believe you are the Christ, the Son of God, who was to come into the world. Martha understands that death on this earth for those who believe in the Son of God and place their faith and their trust in him is temporary. It does not end in everlasting death. And so when Jesus sent that message, this illness will not end in death, even though they watched Lazarus fight the battle and lose the battle against death. They knew that it would be a temporary situation because they looked forward to the hope of resurrection. And you know, this little trio of siblings, they were really close together. I wonder sometimes what their background, what their situation was, and I'm interested to find that out one day when we meet them in heaven, because they were really closely bonded together. And so I imagine that, and this is just my imagination. I want you to know that there's no biblical anything about this, but I imagine that as Lazarus lay there on his deathbed, maybe he was burning up with fever, maybe he was in pain, in agony as he fought this quick onset illness. I imagine that the siblings encouraged each other as the sisters ministered to him and cared for him. They encouraged him, Lazarus, this won't be the end. We will see you again. And Lazarus saying to his sisters, we will meet again because we love God. We know Jesus is the Son, the Messiah. We will meet again. And so even though he died in hope of what was to come. And even though his sisters mourned his death, they mourned in the hope of what was to come. When Martha greeted Jesus with the words, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. She was not berating Jesus. She was not accusing Jesus of not caring, of not being there. She was simply expressing that a disappointment in what could have been and an affirmation of God's power and God's authority to have been able to heal her brother. But she goes further than that in her faith. So often we think verse 22 that says, but I know that even now God will give you whatever you ask. We think that she is asking Jesus to raise her brother right there and then. But that's not quite right. Because when Jesus says to her, your brother will rise again, if she was asking for an immediate resurrection, surely she would have said to him, let's open the tomb, Lord, so that he can come out. But instead, she talks about the resurrection to come. And indeed, when they do go to the tomb and Jesus does ask for that stone to be rolled back, Martha actually reacts with shock and horror. I like the way the King James Version puts it. In the King James, she's recorded as saying, oh, but Lord, by now he stinketh. And so that's not the response of somebody who is expecting God to raise their brother right away. They would have been joyful that the stone was being rolled back from the tomb, not reacting in shock and horror regarding it. So what was Martha saying here? Beloved, what we see here is such an incredible expression of faith. Remember Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the furnace? Or threatened with the furnace by King Nebuchadnezzar. They say to him, it's recorded in Daniel chapter 3, verse 16 and 17, and it says words along the lines of, our God will save us, but even if he does not, we will not bow down to that statue. So they express their faith in the ability of God to save them from that consequence, but they humble themselves to accept whatever God's plan is by saying, even if he does not do that, we will continue to trust and worship him. In the same way, Martha is in effect saying, my brother would not have died if you had been here. And I know that you have the authority and the power of your Father, so you could have healed my brother. No matter where you were, God would have given you whatever you asked. But you chose not to do so. So even now, in my pain, in my suffering, even now in my grief, even now though I don't understand why you did not prevent my brother's death, even now, I trust in you and I acknowledge you as Son of God with your Father's authority and power. This is an expression of faith. Jesus then asked to speak to Mary. And I'm going to go back to Martha. Listen now. Listen. Listen. Faith that is sustained by feelings is a faith that has no foundation. It is a false faith, it is a fair weather faith, and it will fail. Faith that is sustained by feelings is a faith without foundation. It is a false faith, a fair weather faith, and it will fail. Martha's faith did not fail because it was a faith that was sustained by relationship. Martha knew the face of God. Martha had sat at the feet of God. Martha had learned from the words of God. Martha had been shoulder to shoulder with people whose lives had been changed by God. Mary was a sister whose whole life was turned around because of God. So Martha and Mary and Lazarus had a faith whose foundation was their relationship with God. And that kind of faith knows that it can trust and rely on the love of God regardless of the situation we find ourselves in and the accompanying feelings. So Jesus then asked to speak to Mary. Mary cannot leave the place unseen. Everyone's eyes are on Mary. Mary strikes me as being the more expressive of the two sisters. I feel Martha was a little bit more reserved, stoical. People grieve in different ways. Everybody was concerned over Mary. So when she leaves, the people follow her thinking she's going to the tomb. And she comes also to where Jesus is in verse 32. And she fell at his feet. And she also says, Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died. Again, it's an expression of sadness over what could have been, but a humble acceptance of what was. And then Jesus saw her weeping. You know, sometimes we don't have words for God. All we can do is fall down before the Lord and cry. But the Lord understands. And the Lord hears those prayers, even though they are prayers without words. The Lord understands the depth of emotion that we pour out to him. And then Jesus asks to go to the tomb. And as Mary and her sister weep, we see in verse 35 two beautiful words. It says simply, Jesus wept. In those two words, we see the heart of God revealed. This is the God that we serve. We don't serve a God far removed from us, impervious to our struggle, to our suffering. We serve a God who understands what it is to be human. We serve a God who understands what it is to hurt, to mourn, to suffer. And God is empathetic and sympathetic to our suffering. Jesus wept. He shared Mary and Martha's grief, even though he knew what was to come. He cared about their sorrow. This is the heart of the God that we serve. Do not for a moment think that God is impervious or uncaring about your suffering. There's a second reason why Jesus wept that day. Martha and Mary had confirmed their faith that he was the Son of God. But there were people there that day who were part of the people who had wanted to stone him. They rejected the fact that he was the Son of God. And Jesus wept that day for their loss too, because our God seeks to save. For God so loved the world that he sent his only begotten Son, that whosoever believes in him should not perish, but have everlasting life. And Jesus wanted nothing more than those who rejected him to accept him. And he wept for their hardness of heart. This is the heart of the God we serve. Jesus then comes to the tomb and he commands them, take away the stone in verse 39. And I imagine that the people were shocked. I imagine that the people were gathered there and they were all like, what's he doing? They'd already said, look how he weeps. He must have loved him very much. Is he going to open the tomb and fall on top of him, weeping? What's he doing? What's he doing? What's he doing? And as that stone gets rolled away, there's a smell that emanates from that tomb. It's a very distinctive, harsh, awful smell, the smell of death. And I imagine the men covering their mouths. I imagine the women taking their headscarves and putting it across their mouths to filter out the smell. Nobody understands what Jesus is doing. And then Jesus prays. And then he commands. And I imagine his face lighting up with the authority of heaven, and that gentle voice strengthened with God's authority and power as he cries out, Lazarus, come out. And in that moment, I imagine that all the talking, the wailing, the crying quietens. Not a sound is heard as the people look at that tomb door. What is going to happen? And I wonder if any one of them realize that the smell has dissipated. And then they hear a shuffling. And then at the opening of that cave, that tomb door, Lazarus appears wrapped in his cloth. And I think the people would have been in shock. In my mind, I hear a collective drawing of breath. No one can believe what they are seeing. A dead man walking. And nobody moves. You know how I know that nobody moves? Because Jesus has to say to them at the end of verse 44, take off the great clothes and let him go. And I imagine in that moment then Mary and Martha running to the side of their brother and starting to take off those grave clothes, unwinding those bandages. And I imagine that as his face is revealed, his eyes lock into the eyes of Jesus and his mouth says, thank you. This is just my imagination. You know, I like to draw a picture of the situation. And I imagine that as soon as his arms are free, he grabs those sisters as tight as he can. And there's weeping now of a different kind. It's weeping of joy for a brother brought back to life. And I know beyond the shadow of a doubt, because we know who God is, Lazarus never felt so good as he felt in that moment. Any ache or pain that he'd ever had was gone, because when God does things, he does them 100%. And what we see here is a great picture and encouragement for what is to come. We will all experience the resurrection, whether as one brought back to life or as one who is living still when Jesus comes. What a great day that is going to be. We need to understand that we, in the story of Lazarus, has been given a great privilege, because we actually get to see the reason why this terrible thing was allowed to happen. In the raising of Lazarus, there was no way, because he had been dead for 4 days, and the belief at that time was if you were dead for 4 days and beyond, you were properly dead. Up to that time, the belief was that you could come back to life. But by the 4th day, the body was too decayed, and so you wouldn't be able to come back to life. And so the fact that Lazarus had been dead for 4 days meant that nobody, including those on the Sanhedrin Council, could deny the magnitude of this miracle. They could no longer deny that Jesus was who he claimed to be, the Son of God. The raising of Lazarus also served to help the disciples when Jesus was crucified. The experience of Lazarus helped them to understand and to know that Jesus was the Son of God. And that he had the power over death. God had the power over death. The truth of the matter is that in our lives generally, we don't get to have this privilege of understanding why God has allowed things to happen. This is where faith and trust come into the picture. Faith is just a theory until we put it into practice. Faith is just an ideology until we decide to action it. And true faith, who knows God, who has a relationship with God, is willing to trust the love of God even in adverse circumstances. True faith says, Lord, I do not understand. I know you could have, and I don't understand why you didn't. And I'm suffering. But I'm going to trust my situation to you. I'm going to continue to hold fast to my faith. Beloved, Satan's greatest desire is to kill your faith, and he will try to do so by any means possible. Whether you allow it to die or not is up to the decision you make to continue trusting in God in every situation, regardless of your feelings. And so it is my hope and my prayer for each and every one of us that we will continue to build our relationship with our God. And we will be able to say, no matter the circumstances that we are in, no matter the feelings that we have, we will be able to say, blessed assurance, Jesus is mine. This is my story. This is my song. Amen.